For nearly a century, the United States of America has been the sole protector and guarantor of sovereignty across the entire Pacific Basin. Its grand carrier groups and massive navy have ensured this presence and have ensured that peace and stability reign across Asia. However, with the United States now seeming like it's waning, another power is starting to rise in the Pacific: China. The superpower of Asia is beginning to flex its muscles and wake up for the first time since the Chinese Civil War. And they are now looking to clean up the remnants of that war, specifically the island nation of Taiwan. Taiwan is at the center of a new crisis between the United States of America and the People's Republic of China. But if a war were to break out here, what would it look like? How would it turn out? And ultimately, who would win? And would there be any winners to begin with? Today on World Made Simple, we're going to go into a deep dive into what a war between these two superpowers would look like in this scenario. This is Clash of Titans, Taiwan. Hey guys, Bill here, and welcome to another episode of World Made Simple. Today we're going to be doing something a little bit different, and instead of looking into a group of nations or an event, we're going to be talking about something that hasn't happened and hopefully will not happen, and that is a potential wartime scenario phase by phase. This war scenario that we're going to be discussing will be between the People's Republic of China and the United States of America over the island of Taiwan. This is a topic that's popped up in the news a lot recently, and it's something that has several people on edge, both here in the United States and across Asia. So we're going to break down the entire conflict step by step, talking about who the powers are, what they have in their resources, who might support them, and what this war would actually look like. So with that, sit back and we'll get into the nitty-gritty details, starting with who is who. So the obvious thing that we know about this conflict is that it will likely be between three different powers: the United States of America, the People's Republic of China, and Taiwan, also known as the Republic of China. These three forces will basically go ahead and fight for dominance over the Taiwanese Straits, the island of Taiwan itself, and the surrounding Pacific region. The first thing we have to talk about is who would support these powers fighting, and would they get directly involved in the fighting? While China does have some regional allies, none of them are really any big heavyweights, and on top of that, none of them really have any interest in getting involved in a war over Taiwan. Russia's too busy fighting in Ukraine to send any additional forces over or supply China with anything more than maybe some intelligence. The minor powers of Southeast Asia would not want to be dragged into something that they don't even have in their own neighborhood. And the only power that might get involved is North Korea, and China would rather have them sit out than get involved. We'll talk more about that in a second. On the flip side, the US has no shortage of allies who have a grudge against China. This could be nations like Japan, the Philippines, South Korea, Australia, even nations that aren't formally aligned with the US, but could benefit from seeing China fall, such as India. There is a lot of nations who would support this. However, the question is, would they support it directly? In the case of most of the Pacific, the answer is no. The only US ally that would likely get involved directly in the conflict would be Japan, both because it views China as a rival and because they've kind of set out on several occasions that they would intervene should a conflict over Taiwan occur. Now, this is not saying there aren't other powers that could get involved, but in reality, any of the direct fighting is going to be between probably the United States, Japan, and Taiwan fighting China. Question is, how do these militaries stack up against one another? Well, let's start with the ground forces. All of the information that you're seeing in terms of the numbers that are going to be displayed are from Global Firepower Index in regards to the current active duty units that are combat capable. So if anyone has any questions on that, feel free to check out their website. Fantastic place to get information from, and really in-depth detailing. In terms of ground-based forces, China definitely has the advantage here. They have a larger ground-based army in terms of troops and artillery compared to anybody else in the world, including the United States. However, where the United States does exceedingly well is going to be in areas involving motorized vehicles. The US Army is far more motorized and mechanized than the Chinese one is. However, getting those forces over into the region is going to be difficult. Additionally, the US is not expecting to fight a ground war in Asia. It will likely be a naval and air war, so at most, I would expect around a quarter of total US forces to be moved to the area at max. Taiwan and Japan do have decent forces, but they are minuscule compared to the force that they will be fighting. Additionally, trying to move those forces to the island will likely expose them to Chinese attacks. So, in terms of ground forces, China definitely is sitting high and mighty in this category. But as I said, this is not going to be a ground war. This is going to be a naval and air war. So we need to focus less on the ground-based forces and more on the air and naval-based forces. So let's go ahead and take a look and see how these different navies stack up against one another. On paper, the Chinese Navy is one of the most powerful in the world, with over 700 ships in its arsenal of varying sizes. Meanwhile, the United States Navy boasts the largest tonnage in the world, being around 2 billion tons heavier than the Chinese Navy. Additionally, Japan is no slouch, having ranked sometimes as high as number 3 in terms of the world's most powerful navies, with a standing blue water fleet, and also having carrier-based support. Taiwan is lacking in the Navy department. They primarily favor small ships, similar to China, but are not able to produce nowhere near as many as China. If the three navies on the Allied side, being the United States of America, Taiwan, and Japan, merge their navies together, they actually have a bigger fighting force than China in everything but one category, and that one category being small ships. This includes frigates, corvettes, and small patrol boats. The United States operates a blue water navy and as such has very few of these vessels on hand. Taiwan has multiple, Japan has a handful. But because this is going to be a short-range combat mission in terms of China just going over the strait, this is perfect for the Chinese having this large amount of small naval assets. So while they have that definitely in the bag, the area they fall behind on is going to be in terms of fighting ships of a large scale that have a large range. The United States far outclasses China in this regard, and with the help of the Japanese, even more so. However, the US Navy is a global navy. As such, only probably 2/3 of the entire Navy will be focused on this war. While many people would think that would force the US to fall behind, this number included actually still gives the US a numbers advantage over China in terms of anything other than small ships. In terms of the aircraft carriers, I do want to mention one thing. Yes, China does have an aircraft carrier fleet. They have 2 of them currently, and both of them are referred to as training carriers in the Chinese Navy. They're not referred to as full-time combat flat tops. Additionally, their naval aviation corps is somewhat limited. So for those of you expecting this to be a naval air battle, there will be air battles, just not really between carriers, as China's lack of naval aviation is definitely going to be a factor in how their Navy operates. This is still going to be a naval war, and right now it looks like the US has the edge in terms of versatility, in terms of firepower, in terms of a lot of different factors. But the other factor that impacts the Navy is how you have control of the skies. So let's take a look at the air forces of these 4 nations and see how they stack up against one another. This is where things start going rather poorly for China. As China does have a decent air force, it only has around 4,000 aircraft it can call upon, and 3,500 of those are serviceable, usable, and able to actually have a battlefield presence. On the flip side, the United States has the first and second largest air forces in the world, being the United States Air Force and the United States Navy in terms of their carrier aviation. Japan is no slouch either, but it's still nowhere near the size of America, and Taiwan kind of has a token air force, but most of their aircraft are modern and capable of holding their own against 4th-generation combat forces. Which brings us to the issue of 5th-generation combat forces. The United States operates 2 5th-generation combat airframes, being the F-22 Raptor and the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter. China operates a 5th-generation fleet of its own, however, its capabilities are, from what most experts point out, lackluster, as the stealth capabilities seem somewhat limited compared to the American counterparts. We don't really know how effective these aircraft are going to be in the field, as there's been no wars with 5th-generation aircraft as of yet. But most experts agree that it will be a massive game changer with the use of stealth-based fighters. Regardless, this is something the US and their allies have a massive advantage over. However, the US will probably only deploy around 50% of their aircraft to the combat zone, keeping the remainder either in reserve or in the Middle East and over Europe to safeguard against Russia and Iran in case things start going crazy in that direction. The other massive advantage that America has over the Chinese is their tanker and transport fleet. China has 8 tankers, America has over 200. This allows American forces to be deployed almost from anywhere on planet Earth to strike the Chinese mainland. This means that anywhere in China can get hit by American forces, and this is something that the Chinese are acutely aware of. So with all the forces discussed, there's a couple more things we need to talk about before we jump into the actual battle. And the first thing is something I mentioned before, and that is the Koreas. So in this scenario, the Koreas are not going to be playing a role. And the main reason for that is because in an actual wartime scenario, it's unlikely either the United States or China would want those nations involved. South Korea will likely be nervous that the North will try and take advantage of the turmoil in the South to launch an attack with the US distracted. However, the last thing that China would likely want is for Kim Jong-un to get involved. He's unpredictable and uncontrollable in a couple of regards, and the Chinese do not want to escalate this, as their main goal is to take Taiwan, not to take and unify Korea. So they will likely tell Kim Jong-un, do not engage unless you are engaged yourself. The US will likely respond the same way with South Korea, telling them not to attack the North unless the North attacks them. This will likely result in the deployment of more forces to the border by both the United States and China to ensure that both of these nations kind of don't get involved. The United States will likely still use South Korea as a jump-off point, but will probably keep its presence a little bit more limited in terms of striking Taiwan. And that's mainly because if the US turns South Korea into a basically aircraft carrier for them, the Chinese will be encouraged to strike. And if they strike, then North Korea strikes, and then there's a potential of this war turning nuclear. That's something that neither side wants. So for this scenario, the North and South Korean nations will not be playing a role. So with that being said, let's dive into the scenario and see how it could start.